right, welcome to the first episode of Rushmore Sports Betting Podcast, brought to you by the Bulldog Inquirer. On the team today, we got Brennan Kerner, obviously the owner, that is me. To my left, we got Grant McClendon, we have Jackson Dyer, and we have Nick Frias, and we are here to give you the latest and greatest updates on sports betting per week. This week, we're going to talk a little college football and get into some of the upsets that happened last week. Grant, what were your thoughts on the weird, wacky week that we had of Week 8?
Definitely have to say the biggest upset of the weekend was definitely Illinois or Wisconsin. And a bunch of people thought Wisconsin was easily one of the top 5 teams in the country, but going to Champaign, losing on a last-second field goal.
Yeah, Jack Cohen honestly did not play that bad of a game. He threw, I think, for 24 for 32, 264 yards passing, and a touchdown, along with Jonathan Taylor, one of my Heisman favorites personally. I think he should be taken a little more seriously in the Heisman race talks. But he also had a great 100-plus yard game and another touchdown added to his resume. Continues to break records over at Wisconsin. But Jack Cohen, throws a pick really close to the end of the game. I think 2.5 minutes left in the fourth quarter in some costly territory. Illinois capitalized. Congrats to the Illinois kicker for making that field goal and then going back to Champaign a little happier. Jackson Dyer, what were some other games you thought were pretty interesting last week?
I think the most interesting game is Baylor's win over Oklahoma State, because this is the first week where I actually thought that Baylor might be for real. They've rattled off some other wins against some lesser teams, Texas Tech or Kansas State previously, but Oklahoma State shows they might actually be ready to contend for the Big 12. They play Oklahoma in 3 weeks. After playing West Virginia and TCU, they have the ability to be 9-0 playing against Oklahoma for a chance at the Big 12 championship.
Yeah, the Baylor team looks relatively good. Honestly, coming into the season, I thought they were going to look a little sluggish. They have not been that good the past couple of years. Because we back when Bryce Petty was the quarterback and they had other weapons like that, they were pretty good. But recently they haven't been that good. But they have impressed me surprisingly this year, and they are still one of the only undefeated teams in college football. Nick Frias, what did you see this last weekend?
I saw Manny Diaz's Miami team continue to fall apart in what might be the worst loss of his tenure, because Georgia Tech this past year, or this current season, has fallen to being the worst FBS team in a lot of categories, and they just went into Miami and took down a Hurricane team in overtime that game had no business being in overtime.
Yeah, as a lot of Dog fans listen right now, you bet that it's very surprising when a team like Georgia Tech goes down to Miami, Florida, and beats the Hurricanes in an overtime game, a close overtime game. But you expect more from Miami. You expect more from a Mark Richt coach team, and they just have not been that impressive at all this year, and it really hurts. So yeah, that's kind of like the wrap-ups. Other games that I watched personally, Grant and I watched the Tennessee-Alabama game. We saw Tua go down with an ankle injury. He should be back in a couple weeks, but Mac Jones is the quarterback taking over for the next couple weeks. Personally, I think going ahead in these next couple of weeks, you might look to those games and see if you can bet on the other side, because I think this week Alabama and Arkansas, the spread's something like 33.5, and with Mac Jones running that offense and Alabama's defense looking a little sketch, I think that you could bet the other way and go ahead and go bet Arkansas, even though Arkansas, the atrocious fake punt. Any inquiry, y'all got anything to say about that? That was almost worse than Jared Garantano's fumble at the goal line.
Definitely worse.
Yeah, it was just bad. Jared Garantano and the punter for Arkansas looked like Nick Frias back when he was in high school playing quarterback. Dude, it was just rough.
That's me, high school quarterback.
Yeah, obviously, as you can't see behind the scenes, but Nick Frias is a 5'9", 160 stud of an athlete.
I don't know if either of those stats were correct, but we're just going to go with it.
All right, that'll wrap up the intro. Next, we got the rundown of the spreads and over-unders for each game this week in college football, and we'll be right back. right, we are back. While you're listening to this, make sure you're going ahead and going over to check out the www.thebulldog.inquirer.com for more info on Georgia football, basketball. We got NFL, NBA, MLB news, obviously the sports betting, as you're listening to right now. You're listening to the sports podcast brought to you by the Rushmore crew. So we're about to go ahead and list all of the spreads and over-unders for this week. We got 55 games on the docket that you could possibly make some money off of. The first one is this Thursday, October 24th. You got SMU traveling down to Houston. They are a 14-point favorite, and the over-under for that game is about 67.5. That was the only game that Thursday. This Friday, we got USC traveling over to Colorado. They are 13-point favorites in that one. So starting off week 9 for Saturday games at the noon, probably one of the better games this weekend. You got Wisconsin traveling to the Horseshoe, playing the Ohio State Buckeyes. They are 14.5 dogs, and the over/under for that game is about 50.5. One of the only undefeated teams left, along with Ohio State, is Appalachian State. Man, they are a team to be reckoned with in the college football world. We got them 25.5 favorites as they travel to South Alabama, and the over/under for that game is 53. Another game to look forward to over in the lower FBS rankings is Bowling Green travels to Western Michigan. Western Michigan is a huge favorite there, 27 points, and the over/under for that game is 63. Illinois travels to Purdue, and Purdue is an 8-point favorite in that one, the over/under being 58.5. Iowa travels over to Northwestern. Iowa, even though they'll be on the road, the Iowa ranked number 20th in the nation, 10.5-point favorites. The over/under for that game, though, is 37.5, and honestly, I might take the under on that one just because both teams can't score and they have pretty good defenses. Liberty heads over to Rutgers for at the spread being 7.5. Liberty is a favorite. Rutgers just looks awful this year, like they do every year. The over/under for that game is 47. Miami, Florida is going down to Pittsburgh, or going up to Pittsburgh, I guess. Miami, after last week's loss against Georgia Tech, are 5.5-point dogs. The over/under for that game is a 47. Mississippi State travels to Texas A&M College Station, where it is always rocking and the fans are always talking. Texas A&M and the beautiful Aggies are about 10.5-point favorites for that game, and the over/under is 50.5. Oklahoma travels over to Kansas State. They are 24-point favorites there, with the over/under being 58 in a big Big 12 shootout. San Jose State and Army, love that game. Army is playing at home this week, and they are about 10-point favorites, with the over/under being 51. Southern Miss travels to Rice as 10.5-point favorites, with the over/under being 53. Nevada travels to Wyoming, and the Broncos look to win another game there, as they are 13.5-point favorites, with the over/under being 44.5. Ohio travels down to Ball State, where Ball State is the 3-point favorite, and the over/under being 63.5. Look for a big shootout there. Might take the over. Western Kentucky goes down to Marshall, where Marshall is actually 6-point favorites, where the over/under is about 45. New Mexico State goes down to Georgia's own Georgia Southern, where Georgia Southern is having a very good year, and they are 14.5-point favorites, with the over/under being 54 points. Also, a little tidbit of information. I have never seen a whole team actually get penalized for dancing on the sideline, but I think they deserve it. It was to Mo Bamba. That's my reasoning. Auburn travels to Death Valley, where the Tigers of LSU are 11.5-point favorites, and the over/under in that game being 58.5. I actually think that game might be a little close and not as high scoring as some people may think. So, look out for that one. Texas, number 15 in the nation, are 2.5-point favorites as they travel to TCU. The Horned Frogs and the Longhorns will look to try to hit the over/under at 61. Akron travels to Northern Illinois, as Northern Illinois is playing at home, and they are 23.5-point favorites, as the over/under being 44.5. Arizona travels to Stanford in a slugfest of one of the worst Pac-12 teams in the conference right now. Arizona, even though they're going to Stanford, they are 1-point favorites, and the over/under for that game is 53.5. Central Michigan travels to Buffalo, where Buffalo is playing at home, and they are 2.5-point favorites, where the over/under is 49. Connecticut travels to UMass, where Connecticut is 10.5-point favorites, and the over/under for that game is 64 points. Eastern Michigan and Toledo will face off at Toledo's home field, where the Toledo Rockets are over probably, I think, 4-point favorites in that game where the over-under is about 57. Florida Atlantic travels over to Old Dominion, one of the newer teams in the FBS. Old Dominion is at home, but they are 13.5-point dogs. The over-under for that game is 52. FIU heads up to Middle Tennessee State, where Middle Tennessee State is a 2.5-point dog to the Panthers. The over-under for that game is 58.5. Indiana heads over to Nebraska, where Nebraska is a 1-point favorite in that game at home. The over-under for that game is 55. Maryland travels over to Minnesota. The number 17th ranked Golden Gophers are 17-point favorites in that game, with the over-under being 56. The University of Miami of Ohio travels over to Kent State, where Kent State is playing at home, and they are 2.5-point favorites in that one. The over-under for that is 57.5. North Texas goes over to Charlotte. In Charlotte, even though being at home, they are 4.5-point dogs to the Mean Green Eagles of North Texas. What a mascot. The over-under for that game is 65. Oklahoma State travels to Iowa State this week, where Iowa State and the Cyclones are 10.5-point favorites against the Oklahoma State Cowboys. The over-under for that game is 64.5. Penn State heads to Michigan State East Lansing, where that's where the game's going to be played. Michigan State is 6.5-point dogs there, and the over-under is 43.5. Penn State, after beating Michigan this last week, they look pretty good. They look pretty legit, so I might take them on that spread. Syracuse travels down to Tallahassee, where they're going to play Florida State. The Seminoles are 10.5-point favorites in that one. 57.5 is the over-under. Even though I'm flying through this is going to be a big one. Tulane versus Navy. Who's hyped for that game? I know I am. In Annapolis, Navy and the Midshipmen are 3.5-point favorites against Tulane, and the over-under for that game is 52. Virginia heads over to Louisville, where Louisville are 3.5-point dogs. The over-under for that game is 55. South Florida heads over to East Carolina, where the East Carolina Purple Pirates, as I call them, are 2-point dogs, and the over-under for that game is 50 points. Duke, one of Jackson Dyer's favorite all-time teams in pretty much any sport, football, basketball, lacrosse. They're only good at 2 of those. It's at North Carolina this week, Chapel Hill. The Tar Heels are 3.5-point favorites at home, and the over-under being 55. And one of Jackson Dyer's favorite bets is to take the Blue Devils on the over about every single game, because Duke's offense is very potent and they put up a lot of points. Hawaii and New Mexico, are playing at New Mexico this week. New Mexico is 10-point dogs, and the over-under for that game is a whopping 70 points. I don't know how they're going to cover the over on that one. Might have to take the under. Just noticed that one. In the SEC East matchup of the century, South Carolina is heading on over to Tennessee in Knoxville to take on the Volunteers. Tennessee is a 4.5-point dog at home. At home, Tennessee is a dog. When was the last time you heard that? Pretty recently, because they suck. Over-under for that game is 48. Arkansas and the Razorbacks head on over to Tuscaloosa, T-Town, one of my favorite in the nation, to take on the Crimson Tide. 32.5 favorites are the Crimson Tide, and the over-under being 55 points. UCF, the reigning champs, some might say, aren't looking like reigning champs this year. They're heading on over to Temple to play the Owls, where they are 10-point favorites, Central Florida is, with the over-under being 61. I cannot believe there are this many games still to go. Memphis heads over to Tulsa, and Tulsa is 10.5-point dogs to the Memphis Tigers. 56.5 is the over-under there. And just to wrap it up, I'm going to give you a couple of bigger games that we're going to talk about later on. Texas Tech, 3-point favorites against Kansas, which may have to be bet on later. Over-under for that game is 60 points. And Notre Dame, Michigan is dead even. You just pick a winner there, and you hope you pick right because you win some money. Number 24 in the nation, Arizona State. The Sun Devils travel over to UCLA, where they are 4-point favorites, and the over-under is 55.5. Nick Frias is a big Sun Devil fan, so if he doesn't pick them this week, I don't know what's wrong with him. Number 4 in the nation, Clemson, is at home this week against Boston College, where they are 33.5 favorites, and the over-under for that game is 58.5. And over also in the SEC, Missouri takes on Kentucky at Kentucky, where Kentucky is a 10-point dog to the Tigers. 47.5 is the over-under on that game. And over in the Pac-12, Utah is playing California at Utah, where Utah is 18-point favorites. The over-under for that game is 38.5. And that looks to be about it after we get to the last Pac-12 game in the discussion. Washington State, the Cougars head over to Oregon to play the Ducks, where the Ducks are 14-point favorites with the over-under being 64. Let me catch my breath real quick. All right, that's about every game the NCAA has in store for us this week for Week 9 football. And, that was a quick rapid rundown of all these spreads and over-unders that you will see this week. All right, we are back from the rapid rundown of all the spreads and over-unders that you will see in Week 9 college football. This segment will be called the Mount Rushmore of betting. Each team member of the Rushmore crew will go around and say their lock, their upset, and then 2 to 3 games that they think will be good enough to bet on this week. And hopefully you take some of our advices because we actually do know what we're talking about. As each episode progresses, we will keep a record and update every single one of y'all on each teammate's record. But we're going to go ahead and start it off with each of our locks. This week I got Arizona State is -4 against UCLA. I just think that the Sun Devils have looked very good. They've dominated pretty much everybody they've played except for the couple losses that they've had. But, UCLA has just not looked that good this year. And to give Arizona State only 4-point favorites, I think is a little laughable. And I think this is basically just like stealing candy from a baby. Grant, what is your lock of the week?
Lock of the week, Texas 1.5 at TCU. Texas coming off that scare against Kansas, I think they hang it on TCU this weekend.
Jackson Dyer, we got over there. What is your lock for the week?
I'm going with the Alabama versus Arkansas over of 55. I know the over-under is a little low this week because obviously Tua Tagovailoa is hurt, and Mac Jones is going to take care of business behind quarterback. But Alabama's offense is just so good outside of Tua with Jeremy Jeudy and other receivers and great playmakers on that side of the ball. I don't think they're going to have any trouble against the Arkansas defense. And Alabama's defense themselves haven't looked great as of late. So I can expect Arkansas to put maybe 14 or so points to help with that over.
And I'll close this round out with my lock, which is Oklahoma State on their spread. They are 10.5-point underdogs. They've only lost one game by more than 10 this year, and that was the Baylor game last week, where they honestly were trading touchdowns up until that scoop and score strip sack that Baylor had. And I don't know, Iowa State's just been streaky all year, so even though it's at home and I think Iowa State wins, I don't think they can cover that spread. So I'd bet on Oklahoma State.
All right, now we're going to go around and give our upset of the week. And this is just outright. What team do you think will beat the other team in an upsetting fashion? I got a little smaller profile game, but I think Temple and the Owls go ahead and beat UCF this week. UCF, they've been good the past couple of years. They went undefeated back in 2017, but they just haven't looked that good this year. Their offense isn't as potent, and their defense hasn't been flying around like it usually has been. So I got the Owls, and they will actually cover that spread too, and the spread there is 10.5 points. Grant, who's your upset of the week?
I'm taking Houston over the SMU Mustangs. Houston having a little rocky season. Dana Holgerson's first season in at Houston. And SMU, first time being ranked since 1986. And actually undefeated this year. But I think that comes to a halt this weekend. Thursday, actually. That's a Thursday night game. Houston is 13-point dogs against SMU, but I think they win outright against the Mustangs.
All right, my upset of the week is the Duke Blue Devils over the UNC Tar Heels. They're 3.5-point dogs at UNC. Duke has owned this rivalry as of late and won the last couple of years. And Duke suffered a really bad loss last week, but over the last season and a half, they've been really good as underdogs under about 5 points. So look for them to take care of business and bounce back.
And mine is a home underdog in a Southeastern game. I am taking the East Carolina Pirates, who are 2-point underdogs against South Florida. Neither of those teams have looked very good all year, so I'm going to take the home team, and I think they can pull out that game.
Alrighty, and then next we're going to go around and give 2 or 3 of the games that we think you should bet on this week. My first one's going to be Minnesota at home against Maryland. Minnesota's looked very good this year. They are still undefeated, I believe, at number 17 in the nation, and they are actually 17-point favorites against the Maryland Terrapins. Maryland, they started off the season very impressively, actually. They won a couple games that surprised a couple people, but ever since they lost to, I think, Temple it was, they just haven't looked as good. I also have Oklahoma over Kansas State. I think you should bet on that game because I do think Oklahoma covers the 24-point spread. Jalen Hurts is, in my opinion, the top front runner for that Heisman Trophy. His stats back it up. I know he's a grad transfer, and I don't think anybody else would disagree with me that he's been outperforming himself, honestly, from when he was at Alabama. I also this week have Kansas covering their spread. They are going to cover the 3-point spread against, who do they play? Anybody?
Texas Tech.
Kansas plays Texas Tech. Thank you, Jackson Dyer. They Les Miles. He is one of my favorite coaches out right now. I think he will actually get the Jayhawks turned around in the next couple of years, and they might actually go over 500 and make a bowl game in that Big 12 conference. Grant, what are your thoughts on this week?
I'm taking Notre Dame. Line is even, correct?
Yes, it is correct
Yes.
against my Michigan Wolverines.
I'm taking Notre Dame on the road. Their defense has looked good all year, honestly. Only lost to the Dogs in Athens, which was close. Could have won that game at the end. And I think they take care of business against Michigan on the road. And my other one is App State to cover against South Alabama. South Alabama's 1-6. App State, maybe one of the most underrated teams in the country right now, and they're getting 25 against South Alabama. I think they cover that.
All right, my 3 picks this week. My first, I'm going back on Duke UNC. I'm taking the over of 55.
Loving the Blue Devils.
Love the Blue Devils. Duke really plays 1 or 2 games. Either they play really well offensively, take care of business, or their defense just gives up everything. So one of the teams is going to score close to 55 by themselves. My next pick, Virginia, minus 3.5 versus Louisville. They go to Louisville, but I think Virginia is the team out of the Coastal that's going to play Clemson this year in the ACC Championship. I think they've got a little bit of disrespect. They had a tough loss against Miami, but I still think they're the best team in that division. So take them at 3.5. My last pick is Georgia State, 1-point favorite versus Troy at home. Georgia State's having a great year so far. They obviously have their big upset win over Tennessee, and they just beat Army last week, which is rather impressive. So I'm looking for them to keep going and win this game against Troy.
And let's not forget that the Army actually almost upset my Michigan Wolverines at the beginning of the year. Week 2 almost clutched it out in overtime, but they fell by a field goal. Nick Frias, what are your 3 picks that people should bet on this week?
All right, well, I got 3 spreads that I think people should bet on. My first, I know Brendan said he thought this might be a closer game than people expect, but I think down in Death Valley at night, LSU covers a 11.5. I think they win by at least 2 scores. We're going to talk later about our top 4s. I think LSU might be the most complete team in the nation. Grant Delpit's one of the top draft prospects, might be the top non-quarterback draft prospect. And Joe Burrow is a fantastic quarterback with enough weapons that I think they can put up at least 2 touchdowns, especially when Boobie Williams isn't going to play for Auburn. So Auburn won't be scoring very much, and I don't know if their defense can hold the LSU offense. On top of that, I think Penn State covers 6.5. They are going to have a tough game against Ohio State, but up until then, I think they can just kind of cruise through their schedule. And then the last one would be South Carolina, a 4-point spread against a Tennessee team that is going to be playing Jarrett Garantano, who we all saw went rogue on an easy QB sneak that turned into a 102-yard scoop and score for Alabama.
Yeah, this week on the Rushmore Sports Betting Podcast, we discussed actually before the show that we should probably have a not top play of the week. And this week, it was definitely a close one. Arkansas's punter, I don't know what he was looking at, man. He thought that the lineman was just, hey, let me throw that to you. Let me give that away on a fake punt that just was awfully ran. And, Jerry Garantano, as Nick just said, let a 100-yard scoop and score. Over 100-yard. He scooped up in the end zone. And I've never seen a quarterback throw the ball forward on a QB sneak, especially on a 4th and inches on the goal line play. So that wraps it up for our picks of the week, our Rushmore picks of the week. When you come back, we're going to talk about the who should be the top 4 teams in the nation, and just some other games that we will be interested coming up in the near future. Thank you, and we'll be right back. All right, as we wrap this podcast up, the first edition of the Rushmore Sports Podcast that you can check out at, www.thebulldog.inquirer.com. That's The Bulldog with D-O-G is how it's spelled at the end, and Inquirer, INQUIRER.com. You can go ahead and check it out over there. It's also will be on our YouTube channel, the Bulldog Inquirer YouTube channel. I will leave a link to the YouTube on the website, or you can also find the website through the YouTube video. So we're going to go ahead and talk about who should be in the top 4 this week. Personally, in order, I have LSU actually jumping Alabama. LSU's defense has shown a couple signs of deterioration. Like when they played Vanderbilt and gave up a lot of points there, that was a little bit of a red flag. But, who's stopping LSU's offense? Y'all have any idea? Because I have no idea. Because they're not going to get stopped when they play Alabama in a couple weeks.
Yeah, this is not the Bama defense of old. I don't think this Bama team's winning games by scoring more than the other teams, which that is how you win games. But their offense is a lot better than it has been, a lot more complete than it has been in the past. But their defense is also a little bit worse than we've seen in past Saban-led teams. So I don't think they're going to stop LSU. And honestly, if Tua's not back in time, I don't know if they're going to stand a chance against LSU.
Yeah, that makes sense. LSU, I still think, is the number 1 team in the nation right now. Right behind them, especially after this week, and this is kind of just going based off of what we see right now, I actually have Ohio State at number 2. Ohio State's offense is very similar to LSU's offense in where they score on anybody they want. I know Northwestern isn't that good of a team, but their defense is pretty top tier this year, and they put up 52, I believe, on the Northwestern team. That's a big game. So I got LSU at 1, Ohio State at 2. And then I'm going to round out the top 4 with Alabama at 3, just because a Nick Saban coach team always finds a way to win. Even though they will not blow anybody out as people expect this year, they're still going to win those games. And they still might end the season going into the SEC Championship as undefeated. So we'll see, especially when they play LSU in a couple weeks. But that'll be probably the game of the century if they both keep being at 1 and 2. In the AP polls. And then to round out my top 4, I'm kind of doubtful of the Clemson Tigers, but, they're still undefeated. They haven't really been tested a lot, and they almost coughed up a loss to the North Carolina Tar Heels over in Chapel Hill. But, I still think Trevor Lawrence, even though he's had a couple bad games, still produces to a high level. Their offense is too good, and their defense is surprising well for being in the ACC. Grant, what is your top 4?
Number 1, I got Bama. Can't go wrong with Nick Saban coach team. That offense is explosive. Yes, we've seen their defense be shaky in some parts throughout the year, but still think the number 1 team. LSU at 2. That offense, probably one of the best in the country, without a doubt. Joe Burrow in the Heisman discussion for sure through the middle of the year. I got Ohio State at 3. they have just creamed everybody they have played. Justin Fields definitely looks like a Heisman contender halfway through the year, and those young receivers around him know how to play. And I'm gonna leave Clemson out. I got OU, Oklahoma, at number 4. Oklahoma, Jalen Hurts. Transferred over from Alabama. He's looked really good all year. That defense is better than we have seen in past couple years. Their defense actually looks decent. In Clemson, my reason for leaving them out is, Clemson hasn't looked good really all year. The best team they've played is Texas A&M, who's 4-3, and they only beat them by 14 points at home. And A&M turned the ball over 4 times as well. So,
just being in the ACC, you're not playing anybody the whole year. It looks rough. For them.
I just think OU. I just think OU is a better team than Clemson right now.
Unfortunately, just how the way the season plays out, the Clemson Tigers most likely will get a bid to the college football playoffs, just because they will probably be ACC champions and win out the rest of the season. Unless they trip up. They almost tripped up to North Carolina. They could possibly trip up to another team, especially maybe that South Carolina game at the end of the year. That'll be an interesting one this year after South Carolina and the Gamecocks actually traveled to Sanford Stadium and beat the Dogs by 3 in double overtime. That was one of their signature wins that actually might keep Will Muschamp at Columbia for a little bit longer. Jackson Dyer, what are your top 4 as of right now?
My number 1 is LSU. I'm not sure if they're the best team, but their body of work is the best so far. They have impressive wins against Texas and Florida. And the Florida game, I think, was very telling in the fact that Joe Burrow is not the same Joe Burrow we saw last year. And there was a little bit of doubt how he would respond to the pass rush from Florida, and he did pretty well. I'm not sold on LSU's defense, but their offense is really good. And the matchup with Alabama in 2 weeks is going to be a lot different than the 9-6 game we saw a couple years ago. I don't think it's going to be as high scoring as we all expect. I think both those teams are going to play up together. But I do think that LSU has the best resume in the country at this point. My number 2 is Ohio State. I think they might be the best team in the country. The fact that their defense is much better than they have been in forever. Last year you had Dwayne Haskins throwing for 50 touchdowns, and they would still lose to Purdue because their defense is shaky. And I don't think their defense is capable of doing that this year. And Justin Fields looks really good. I expect them to roll through the Big Ten and come out as a champion and make the playoffs.
I'd still be a little skeptical of that game at the end of the year. It's at the Big House, Michigan Wolverines. My Michigan Wolverines might come away with an upset in that game.
My 3rd team is Oklahoma, and they're kind of for the same reasons, that their defense is much better than it has been in a while. I think the Texas game shows you just how good they are, and they don't have to be that good with the way Jalen Hurts is playing. He fits the offense perfectly. That just had number 1 picks in Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield. I think he's gotten better throwing than he was when he was at Alabama, and he's also playing defenses that are not near as good. I think they also go undefeated because I don't know who they would slip up against, except for maybe Baylor in 2 weeks. And rounding out my top 4 is Alabama. And I think you can never count out a Nick Saban team, like we've been saying. And I just don't think Alabama's body of work is as impressive as anyone else's in the top 3. They don't have that great of wins. You've seen them kind of struggle a little bit against Ole Miss and Tennessee, and they do always win. And their athletes on offense are maybe unmatched. But if Tua can stay healthy, they're going to have a shot. But I'm just not sure about that defense.
And to round out our head on the Mount Rushmore sports cast, we have Nick Frias. What are your top 4?
Well, thankfully all 4 of us are going to have different top 4s. I was kind of worried we'd have similar things. Most of us have the same teams, but just ranked differently. I agree with most everyone here that LSU should have the top spot, just because regardless of whether you think they're the most complete team or not, they have 2 wins against teams that were ranked in the top 10 at the time of playing them, one of which is still in the top 10, which would be Florida, and Texas when they played them was in the top 10, and honestly, I think a lot of people thought they would be better this season than they have kind of turned out to be. Not that they've turned out to be bad, but I think people thought they'd compete a lot more with Oklahoma than they necessarily have to this point in the season. And yeah, I just don't know, regardless of how many points that defense lets up, I'm not sure what defense in the country can stop Joe Burrow and the LSU offense enough times to beat them. And then
And also, I'd like to point out that LSU beat Mississippi State last week 36-13, and honestly, putting up 36 points was actually low for them. The LSU offense is so high-powered that beating a team by 23 is just actually not They're not producing, honestly, in that game. I expect them to blow their team out by 40 points. Nick Frias, who's your number 2?
My number 2 is, along with what Jackson said, Ohio State. I don't know if they're the most complete team. This part, the end of October into November, is where their schedule with Wisconsin, with Penn State, with Michigan. This is where we're going to see the real Ohio State. We'll see if they can keep it up and if they really are this team that they've shown so far, or if they collapse when they start to play a little bit more competition. Number 3, I have Alabama, because it's a Nick Saban coach team. They have to be in the top 4, and even though they don't necessarily have the strongest resume out of the other 3 or 4 teams you could put in the bottom half of the top 4, none of those teams really have a super strong schedule or resume at this point. So I would put the SEC resume over both the ACC and Big 12 resumes. And at 4, I am going to have to go with Oklahoma, because Clemson has just not looked like the same Clemson team through this point in the season as the one that won the national championship. And I think there's a lot of time for them to turn it around, and I don't really think they lose any games this year, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see the Clemson Tigers in the playoffs. But to this point, Jalen Hurts and the Oklahoma Sooners look like the 4th best team in the country.
Alrighty, as we wrap up the Rushmore Sports Podcast brought to you by the Bulldog Inquirer, I'm going to go around the group in one name. Name me, as of right now, your Heisman favorite. Grant, go ahead.
Justin Fields.
Jackson Dyer.
I'm going to go with Joe Burrow.
I am going to go Jalen Hurts.
I am also going to go Jalen Hurts. Thank you for tuning in to the Rushmore Sports Podcast. Once again, cannot forget, brought to you by thebulldog.inquirer.com. You can go ahead and follow us on Instagram at The Bulldog Inquirer and on Twitter at Inquirer Bulldog. And soon there will be a Facebook page, and you can go ahead and also check this out on the YouTube channel, The Bulldog Inquirer. Make sure you like the video, subscribe, and if you have any questions that you'd want us to answer on next week's podcast or in my weekly video on Mondays, the post-game inquiries, you can go ahead and comment those below. Post-game inquiries is also up on YouTube right now. Make sure you go ahead and check that out. But I appreciate everybody tuning in. Hopefully you stay towards the end and got some all this good content, and hopefully you make some money this week. Thank you for tuning in. See you guys.